All right, so now we're going to talk about the critical reading here. And critical reading is pretty identical across both the tests, It's basically these four categories. ACT is very straightforward, 4 passages. Prose fiction, social sciences, humanities, natural sciences, always in that order, 1 passage, and then there is a paired passage, can show up on any of those 4 categories, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 10 questions per passage. SAT is a little different. So far, it's been 6 passages per test, somewhere around 8 to 10, maybe even a few more questions per per passage, a little bit more mixed up. The SAT also has the archaic writing section. So that's going to be either a passage from a book written in the early 20th century or the 19th century, or it's going to be a speech or letter given by somebody from the 19th century. It's a little bit more challenging, primarily because of the vocabulary and diction. So do be aware of that. And if you have a chance to practice that, if you don't have an English program or a reading class where they read those old texts, do try to at least read, say, Jane Eyre or something from Jane Austen, just so you're a little bit familiar with that. Prose fiction is going to be the first section, at least on the ACT, and it's generally been so far on the SAT as well. And prose fiction is a section, a short story, or a section from a novel or a short story, and basically it's about 500 to 850 words or so. The key to the prose fiction passage is that it's about characters. So we're going to talk a little bit in the next slide when we get there about how you should break these passages down. But what you want to focus on with prose fiction is characters. Who are the characters? What are their relationships to each other? How do you know that? What are their attitudes and opinions? How do you know that? What are their personalities like? And how do you know that? There's not enough room for a whole lot of plot questions. It's 500 to 850 words. The plot's usually summarized in a single sentence. They don't care about things like theme or literary devices or repeating figures or motifs. It's about characterization. How do authors create characters and give them distinct personalities? And how do you know that? How do you know one character has this feeling about another character? So focus on characters with prose fiction. With social science, these passages are generally about things that have to do with, let's say, the relationships of people. So it might be about how the car became more popular in the United States and from the 1900 to 1950. It might be about how suburban sprawl is or is not a problem. It might be about young people's participation in politics. It might be about the development of dancing in the 1980s. Just something about what people do on a broad basis. And the thing to understand about this passage, which is nonfiction, and the other nonfiction passages, the humanities and natural science passages, is that at the end of the day, they're about experts writing to an audience. And broadly speaking, experts do 2 things. They explain things to non-experts. They get into arguments with other experts. The easier passages tend to be where an expert is trying to explain something to a larger audience. So imagine a historian trying to explain how the Harlem Renaissance occurred and what happened during it and when it ended. That would be one thing that you might see on a social science passage, and it's going to be pretty explanatory. The higher difficulty passages are going to have an expert getting into arguments with other experts without always making that clear. So, for example, you might have a passage about, let's say, recycling. And the passage author might say, some believe that recycling is an unmixed good. There's no downside to doing it, but they ignore these costs. Well, they haven't cited any experts, but implicitly that author is arguing over whether or not these other experts are right that recycling is absolutely good and has no downsides. That's what you want to focus on, the implicit arguments with other experts, because what they're going to try and do is they're going to try and misattribute opinions to either the author or to the other individuals involved, the other experts that are being implicitly argued with. So focus on Whether or not basic explanation, great, you're just looking for facts and what comes first, what comes next, or whether you have opinions that are being expressed, and make sure you keep straight whose opinion is whose. After that, we have humanities. Humanities passages are about art, broadly speaking. Could be a classical musician's career, could be about a particular style of sculpture, could be about a particular school of dance or style of dance, but it's generally about art. The easier passages, like the easier social science passages, an expert is trying to explain something to you. In the higher difficulty passages, you have an artist reflecting or thinking about inspiration or what caused them or other artists to make certain artistic choices in their lives. So what you get with the humanities is that an artist might say something like, when I was a young painter, I wanted to capture light, and then as I became older, I wanted to capture darkness, and now that I am a mature artist, I want to capture the interplay of light and darkness. Well, you can be sure that if the artist says something about that, about their inspiration or about what their focus is, there's going to be a question that misattributes what the artist is trying to do. There will be a question that says, the painter characterized their goals as a young painter as capturing the interplay of light and dark. Notice that's not what I said. The mature artist in their last stage wanted to capture the interplay of light and dark. That's a misattribution, but it's a fact that you could see in the passage, and if you're not careful about, might trap you. So be careful with the higher difficulty humanities passages. Who is saying what thing about what is going on? After that, natural science. And natural science, pretty straightforward. It's what you see in your science classes. So it could be a passage about some chemical reaction or some mystery in chemistry. I've seen in practice materials a passage about the formation of snowflakes, for example. Could be biology, could be astronomy, could be volcanology about volcanoes, something having to do with the natural world. Again, the easier passages and experts trying to explain something to you. The harder passages are about why scientists got something wrong, what studies or experiments they did to figure out a question or a lingering issue, and then what questions remain to be answered. And again, you want to be careful because they're going to misattribute things. They are going to say, oh, this conclusion that the scientists had when they first started the research, that's actually the conclusion they came to at the end of all the research, right? And the answer is nope, that's not the way it's going to be set up. It's going to be in the passage, you're going to be able to find it in the passage, but it's being misused, and you're actually going to get it incorrect if you're not careful about that. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of these passages. And so first things first, most common question I get about critical reading is passage first, questions first. The answer is this, always passage first. If you attack the questions first, what ends up happening is that you have to reread the passage pretty much for every single question. You read the passage first, you read it one time, relatively quickly, trying to focus on where things are in the passage. Don't try to memorize the passage. Don't try to even understand everything necessarily in the passage. Focus on where things can be found and where you can come back to find them. So you do that, you read the passage once, and then what you're doing is for each question, you're just going back to the part of the passage that you need to look at to find the correct answer. You're not trying to look through the whole thing again and again. You start with the questions, you don't know where that information is, and you end up skimming the whole passage for almost every single question. So you might end up reading a passage 2-3 times if you read it first. If you attack the questions first, you're going to end up reading that passage perhaps as many as 7 or 8 times. So it may seem a little strange, but it actually saves you time to read the passage first. You want to take some brief notes, and the handouts that we have for the live presentations have a sample passage all marked up that should be available for download as well. But the main idea is you don't have to write careful notes along the side, underlining key points or key ideas, circling them, arrows, a brief word here and there, a star next to somebody's name. You know, for the prose fiction, you might want to circle every time a character appears, or the first time a character appears. Those kind of notes can both be very helpful in going back to the passage, and they usually don't take too long. It takes less time than you think. So I have indicate conflict here. That's for the prose fiction passages. Usually there is some kind of conflict between at least one character and another. If you can find that, you can almost always be assured that's going to be one of the questions there. After you've gone ahead, you've read the passage, you've marked it up a little bit to help you find stuff, you attack the questions, you read the question, you try to answer the question first before looking at the answer choices. Now, that's not going to work for every single question. Some questions you're not going to have a good idea. Some questions are phrased in a way that makes it impossible. They say, which of the following? Well, you can't predict that. You got to look at the answer choices and go back to the passage. But generally speaking, the large majority of questions you can predict an answer to, and you want to do that. The reason why is because you are stressed when you are taking these tests. You are trying to get to the answer as quickly as you possibly can. The problem with that is the test maker knows it. And they know that if you look at an answer choice and the first half of it looks perfect, your brain is going to want to stop looking at the second half, pick that answer, and be done and move on. So what they do is they trap people who aren't careful readers by making the first half of an answer choice absolutely correct, putting one single word that is not accurate or characterizes what's in the passage, and then the rest of the answer choice is correct. If you try to answer the question first before looking at those answer choices, you're much less likely to be caught by that kind of a trap because you're looking for something, not just receiving suggestions from the test maker as to why this answer or that answer might be correct on first glance. So try to answer the question first, then go to the answer choices. It helps avoid getting trapped by tempting wrong answer choices. The SAT has also a certain question type where they will give you a question, whatever it is. The question after it says, where in the passage would you best find support for this answer? These questions are some of the most miserable ones my students see, but the good news is if you turn them around, they can actually make the pair easier to solve. So here's what I mean by that. When you look at a section on the test, so you turn over to your first reading section, you see the passage on one side, you see the questions on the other, just quickly skim the questions and look for the ones that say, which of the following best supports your answer in the prior question? Circle the number around that prior question. It shouldn't take you very long. It should take you a few seconds for each passage, because what happens is when you look at that first question, guess what? The second question actually gives you 4 hints as to where the answer is. So if you turn that question style around, look at those 4 locations, then do the question in front of it, you actually have a roadmap to answering that first question instead of just going blind on it. So you can actually take some of the more challenging and tricky question types, turn it on its head, and actually make it one of the easier question types that are out there. So remember, you don't have to do these in the order the test maker gives them to you. You just have to do them in the allotted time. So feel free to go ahead, skim for those linked questions, look at the second one before the first one, and let that guide your approach.